that I put 2 website addresses on the top page.
Yep.
They are the Rivers of Joy page, as well as my personal page. What is interesting in it, I put outlines on one of those 2 sites. What is really neat on my Grow by Learning website, if you get to that page, when it comes to verses, if you click on, if you put your mouse on that arrow on the verses, it'll show up. You actually can read the verses right on the web page, and that is really excellent and really good to do that. So those are the 2 websites I use to put on my sermons that I preach, and normally they are not more than 15 minutes each session. Depending on the amount of sermons, they're about 15 minutes per session, so you can listen to one and take time to listen to the other occasionally, and I think that you will get more out of it the second time around. Charity was writing this, seeing what I put down: Baptist, Reformed, Calvinist, Dispensationalist, Credo, Baptist, Doctrine of Grace, Lordship, Salvation, Salvation by Grace with Soteriology, Called, Convicted, and Converted. She says, "You're none of those things." And I said, "No, I am." So, next time someone talks to you, by the way, if you ever need an extra copy of this material, there they go, one by one. I trust that you will. You can always get an extra copy, and I think it'll be a blessing for you too. In the last hour, we did talk a few minutes about this whole. We're in Luke chapter 6. If you open your Bibles to Luke chapter 6, we are now in verse 20 through verse 26. And he lifted up his eyes on his disciples and said, "Blessed be ye poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are ye that hunger now, for ye shall be filled. Blessed are ye that weep now, for ye shall laugh. Blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you, and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake." Verse 23, "For rejoice ye that in that day," verses 2 through verse 22, "leap for joy. For behold, your reward is great in heaven. For in the like manner did their fathers with unto the prophets." And then verses 24 through verse 26 are the woes. Woe if you are just reversed. So 20 through verse 23 is the believer, and verse 24 through verse 26 is the unbeliever. Isn't it interesting, as we were studying in the last hour, someone may say, well, if God knew before the foundation of the world who was going to be saved and who was going to be lost, and he elected those unto salvation, isn't it interesting that when we come to the Beatitudes, the first 4 in Luke are sharing with us what salvation is, and then the latter 3 verses is saying, "Woe to those who do not receive God's salvation." I find that quite interesting. The call, as we look at this text, we began in verse 17, if you recall, some time ago, and I think this is the 90th sermon. No, wait a minute. Excuse me, it isn't. I don't remember. I wrote it down somewhere. I can't remember how many messages I preached to Luke. Maybe something like 90, maybe. I can't remember. You remember that in verse 17, or in verse 12 through verse 16, Jesus has chosen the 12 apostles. And it was interesting, as often as I do, what really causes me to have 40 pages of notes. My problem is I begin to look at the text and I'm trying to figure out what's going on behind the scenes. I'm the person that likes to go backstage and see how they did something. How is this set up? And it came to pass in those days that he went out into a mountain and prayed, verse 12. And I like to picture that. And then he comes back to his disciples, and then he begins to call out his disciples. And if you recall, we spent a great deal of time talking about his disciples. Then I thought, how did this all happen? How did they become his disciples? How did they become believers? When did they start following him? And what did they do after he called them? And it is amazing how little, it is amazing how much I've learned, and you would think that I would know a lot. I know a lot, but there's so much more to know. And I was, and what the study did is when you read Matthew and you read Mark and you read Luke and John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all say it differently. They all are looking at the same story, the same event, the same people, and they say it differently. They will, just like in this chapter, Luke only records 4 of the Beatitudes, and Matthew records at least 8. Here, Luke records woes. And so I'm looking at this text, and I'm saying, he calls his disciples. And you remember when we looked through this, Jesus, and I wonder, what was the timeline? What was the timeline? I'll tell you, if you ever come across Holly's. This is a chronological Bible. If you ever get a chance to go there and buy a chronological Bible, this is fascinating in that it chronicles the life of the whole Bible. But I was looking in Matthew, and I said, how could you take the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they put it in sequences in order that Jesus had his life? How did Jesus select his disciples? When did he select his disciples? When were they called? When were they not called? What did they do after they called? And you have to go through all of that process. And what I discovered was that when we come to this particular area, Jesus called the disciples, and oftentimes they went back to their job, net fishing. So he called them and to be in ministry, and then they decided, well, we're going to have to think about this. So they went back to their own home, went back to their own business, and Jesus circled back around and said, hey, this is time for you to do this. And when we come to Luke chapter 6, Jesus is in the mount, and the disciples are among the 5,000 people out there. They were just among the front line, and he says, I think now it's time for us to get serious, and I'm now going to call you an apostles. Sometimes God calls, if God calls, he calls us into salvation. I sensed when I was in the 8th grade that the Lord was dealing with me to be a preacher. And of course, that was the very last thing I wanted to do, is to preach. And so I looked at it and thought about it, forgot it, and I decided to do something else. And eventually, the Lord called me again. Apparently, or at least my dad did, somebody did. And so I got this feeling, and I was thinking about the disciples. They went back to their own business. Jesus went about his business. Then he did this, and he did this, and eventually he comes to this part, and he says, this is time I want you to come up the mountain with me. And I want you to learn. And so it took a while from the time they were called to learn, and then they went to seminary, and then they were sent out. And it's not much more like us. God may implant in our mind the need to be saved. It may take a while for it to happen, and then God, through the Holy Spirit and through individuals, encourages us, and then God does something else. And I thought, that is just wonderful how he does that, and he calls all the disciples to do that. It becomes a personal conversion. When we come to this chapter, number one, there is always a faith. The 4 men whom the Lord called had heard his voice on the bank of Jordan, and they followed him, and they journeyed with him in Judea, and even, it seems, they baptized in his name, and they after that, Jesus returns to Galilee. In John chapter 5, they had apparently gone back to their own business. First of all, they believed in him. Secondly, they believed in him. But they did not realize the constraint of a supreme influence. They did not hold themselves as solemnly engaged to him. They believed in him as Jesus, perhaps. They had faith in him, but they weren't ready to give their life to him. Well, that sounds like a lot of people, don't it? They may be saved, they may be on the process, on the verge of becoming a Christian, but they're not quite there yet. It doesn't mean that people are saved instantly. They're saved instantly, but sometimes it takes a while for it to move in. And so they believed in him. It was this engagement to be his. Going where he went, dwell where he dwelt, work day by day with him,